There's about 4.4 billion pounds of wool waste produced globally every year, and most of it ends up in landfills where it sits for decades doing absolutely nothing useful. Meanwhile, desertification is destroying 30 million acres of productive land annually. So some brilliant people looked at these two problems and thought, what if the solution to one is literally sitting in a pile somewhere rotting? Sheep might be saving the planet without even knowing it. Let's get into this. First, let's talk about what wool waste actually is, because it's not what you're thinking. You're probably imagining your old sweater that doesn't fit anymore. That's consumer waste, and yeah, there's a lot of that. But the real waste happens way before that sweater ever gets to a store. It happens during processing. When raw wool comes off a sheep, it's disgusting. It's full of lanolin, dirt, feces, vegetation, sweat, and sometimes chunks of sheep skin. Not exactly ready for a knitting circle. The wool industry has to clean all of that out. The process is called scouring, and it removes about 30 to 70% of the raw fleece weight. All that stuff that gets removed, that's waste. Millions of pounds of it every year. Then there's the wool that gets rejected because it's too coarse, too short, or just poor quality. More waste. Then there's the trimmings from cutting and shaping during manufacturing. Even more waste. Historically, this waste had a few options. Burn it, which creates air pollution and wastes potential nutrients. Dump it in landfills where it takes decades to break down and produces methane as it rots. Or in some cases, dump it in rivers and streams, which sounds insane but actually happened for years until environmental regulations caught up. None of these options are good. They're all just variations of throwing away a resource because we couldn't figure out what else to do with it. But here's where it gets interesting. Wool is almost pure protein. It's made of keratin, the same stuff in your hair and fingernails. When wool breaks down naturally, it releases nitrogen, one of the most important nutrients for plant growth. It also releases other minerals like sulfur, calcium, and potassium. Basically, wool is a slow-release fertilizer hiding in plain sight. We just weren't using it that way. Now let's talk about degraded land, because this is the other half of the equation. Degraded land is soil that's lost its ability to support plant life. This happens for a bunch of reasons. Overgrazing, where too many animals eat all the vegetation and compact the soil. Deforestation, where trees get cut down and suddenly there's nothing holding the soil in place. Poor farming practices that strip nutrients without replacing them. Climate change causing droughts and temperature extremes. All of this turns productive land into basically dirt that can't grow anything. The scale of this problem is massive. The UN estimates that about 40% of the world's land is degraded. That's an area larger than South America. This affects over 3 billion people who depend on that land for food and livelihood. When land degrades, you get food insecurity, poverty, migration, conflict. It's not just an environmental problem, it's a humanitarian crisis. Traditional solutions to land degradation are expensive and slow, but those are costly and often make the problem worse, long-term by killing beneficial soil organisms. You can irrigate, but water is increasingly scarce and expensive. You can plant trees, but they take years to establish and don't always survive in degraded conditions. We needed something better, something cheaper, more sustainable and faster acting. Enter wool waste. Researchers started experimenting with using wool waste as a soil amendment in the early 2000s. The idea was simple on paper. Take this organic waste that's piling up, spread it on degraded land, and see what happens. First challenge was the physical form of the wool. You can't just dump raw fleece on soil and expect magic. The wool needs to be processed into a form that works with the soil. Some researchers tried chopping it into small pieces. Some experimented with turning it into pellets. Each method had advantages and disadvantages. Chopped wool mixes into soil easily but can blow away in wind. Mats stay in place but don't integrate with soil as well. Pellets are easy to spread but take longer to break down. The researchers also had to figure out the right application rate. Too little wool and you don't see much benefit. Too much and you can actually harm plant growth, because the decomposition process temporarily ties up nitrogen in the soil. The sweet spot seemed to be around 10 to 30 tons per hectare, which is about 4 to 13 tons per acre. But remember, we've got billions of pounds of waste to work with. Then there was the question of how quickly the wool breaks down and releases nutrients. This depends on soil conditions, temperature, moisture, and microbial activity. In warm, moist conditions with active soil biology, wool can start breaking down in weeks. In dry, cold, or biologically dead soil, it might take months or even years. The researchers needed to match the wool application to the specific conditions of the degraded land. Here's where the results started getting exciting. Early trials showed significant improvements in soil structure. Wool fibers act like tiny sponges, absorbing water and holding it in the soil. In one study in Spain, soil treated with wool waste retained 30% more moisture than untreated soil. That's huge in arid or semi-arid environments, where water is the limiting factor for plant growth. The wool also improved soil structure by increasing organic matter content. Degraded soils are often compacted and hard, making it difficult for plant roots to penetrate and for water to infiltrate. Adding wool creates air spaces, improves drainage, and makes the soil more workable. The soil becomes fluffier, for lack of a better technical term. Plant growth responded dramatically. In trials in Iceland, researchers spread wool waste on degraded volcanic soil that barely supported any vegetation. Within 2 growing seasons, plant cover increased by over 400%. Species diversity also increased. Where before there might be 1 or 2 hardy species barely surviving, now there were a dozen different plant species thriving. The ecosystem was rebuilding itself. The nitrogen release was particularly important. Microorganisms break down the keratin proteins and release nitrogen in forms that plants can use. This happens slowly over months or years, providing a steady supply of nutrients rather than a quick spike that can wash away in the first rain. It's like a time-release fertilizer capsule, except it's made of sheep hair. But here's something unexpected that researchers discovered. The wool doesn't just benefit the soil chemistry and structure. It also provides physical protection for young plants. In harsh environments with strong winds or intense sun, seedlings often die before they can establish. The wool fibers create a microclimate around the plants, shading them from extreme heat, protecting them from wind, and maintaining more stable temperatures. Essentially, the wool waste acts like a nursery for baby plants. Let's look at some real-world applications, because this has moved beyond just research trials. In Spain, there's a project using wool waste from local sheep farms to restore degraded pastures. Spain has a huge sheep population, millions of animals, and a corresponding wool waste problem. They also have extensive degraded rangelands that no longer support grazing. The project spreads wool waste on these lands along with native grass seeds. The results have been impressive enough that farmers are now requesting wool amendments for their degraded pastures. In Iceland, where I mentioned earlier, wool waste restoration is addressing a specific environmental crisis. Iceland has lost about 50% of its original vegetation and soil since human settlement. Erosion is severe, desertification is advancing, and traditional restoration methods are expensive and often fail. Wool waste has proven effective even in Iceland's harsh climate, with short growing seasons and severe weather. The Icelandic researchers have fine-tuned their methods, and are now scaling up application across thousands of hectares. Australia, another country with massive sheep populations and massive land degradation problems, is experimenting with wool waste pellets for mine site rehabilitation. When mines close, they leave behind landscapes that are essentially moonscapes. Dead soil, no organic matter, often contaminated with heavy metals. Traditional rehabilitation requires importing topsoil and adding huge amounts of fertilizer. Wool pellets offer a cheaper alternative that also sequesters carbon and reduces waste. In the UK, there's a project using wool waste to restore peatlands. Peatlands are critical carbon sinks, but degraded peatlands release carbon instead of storing it. The wool helps re-establish vegetation that eventually rebuilds the peat. This is particularly clever because sheep farming in the UK produces enormous amounts of wool waste, and the UK has extensive degraded peatlands. It's matching a local waste stream with a local environmental problem. Now, you might be wondering about the economics of all this. If wool waste restoration is so great, why isn't everyone doing it? Good question. The answer is complicated and involves logistics, economics, and human behavior. First, collecting and transporting wool waste costs money. Not collect and store it. You need collection systems, storage facilities, and transportation to get the waste from where it's produced to where it's needed. In remote areas, this can be expensive enough to make the whole thing economically unviable. Second, processing the wool waste into a usable form adds cost. Whether you're chopping it, felting it, or pelletizing it, that requires equipment, energy, and labor. Some projects have tried to minimize this by using the waste in its rawest form, but that creates application challenges and inconsistent results. Third, there's competition from other uses for wool waste. Some of it gets used for insulation in buildings. Some gets composted and sold to gardeners. Some is used in erosion control products. These existing markets pay money for the waste, which means restoration projects have to compete economically. Fourth, and this is important, farmers and land managers are conservative about trying new methods. If you've been farming the same way for decades, you're not necessarily excited about spreading sheep hair on your fields because some researcher says it might help. There's risk involved. What if it doesn't work? What if it introduces pests or diseases? What if it violates organic certification rules? Convincing people to adopt new practices takes time and demonstration projects that prove the concept. But the economics are improving. As landfill costs increase and environmental regulations tighten, disposal of wool waste is getting more expensive. This makes using it for restoration more competitive. Some regions have started offering subsidies or grants for sustainable land restoration, which helps offset the costs of collection and application. And as the methods are refined and scaled up, the per-hectare costs are dropping. There's also a carbon angle to this that's becoming increasingly relevant. When wool waste goes to landfills, it produces methane as it decomposes. Methane is a greenhouse gas about 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide. That's a powerful sustainability story. A few textile companies have partnered with restoration projects, funding wool waste application in exchange for the environmental credentials. Let's talk about some of the challenges that still need to be worked out. One is contamination. Not all wool waste is created equal. Some contains dyes, chemicals from processing, or pesticides from sheep dipping. Using contaminated wool waste on land could introduce pollutants. The restoration projects have to carefully source their wool waste from clean sources, which limits supply and increases costs. Another challenge is consistency. Wool from different breeds of sheep has different properties. Fine merino wool breaks down differently than coarse carpet wool. Wool from different processing stages has different contamination levels and nutrient contents. For restoration projects to succeed consistently, they need consistent inputs. This means developing standards and testing protocols for wool waste, which the industry hasn't really done yet. There's also the question of scale. The projects I've mentioned are impressive, but they're treating hundreds or maybe thousands of hectares. The global degraded land problem is hundreds of millions of hectares. Even if we used every pound of wool waste produced globally, it would only treat a tiny fraction of degraded land. Wool waste restoration is part of the solution, not the whole solution. That said, wool waste is particularly well suited for certain types of restoration. Remote areas where transporting chemical fertilizers is expensive. Arid environments where water retention is the key challenge. For these specific contexts, wool waste might be one of the best tools available. Research is continuing to optimize the methods. Scientists are experimenting with combining wool waste with other amendments like biochar, compost, or native soil bacteria. They're testing different application timing to match plant growth cycles. They're developing better processing methods that are cheaper and more effective. Every year, the methods get a bit better and the costs come down slightly. There's also interest in using wool waste for urban greening projects. Cities have degraded soils too, often contaminated with heavy metals and lacking organic matter. Parks, street trees, and green roofs could all potentially benefit from wool waste amendments. Urban areas have the advantage of being close to population centers where wool processing often happens, reducing transportation costs. Some researchers are even looking at using wool waste in developing countries where both wool production and land degradation are significant problems. Mongolia, for instance, has a huge sheep population and extensive desertification. Peru has alpaca wool production and degraded mountain pastures. These countries often can't afford expensive imported fertilizers, but have abundant local wool waste. The challenge is building the knowledge and infrastructure to implement wool waste restoration in resource-limited settings. Here's something interesting that emerged from the research. The microbial communities in soil treated with wool waste are different from those in untreated soil. The wool seems to promote beneficial fungi and bacteria that help plants take up nutrients and resist disease. Some researchers think the wool might be inoculating the soil with microbes from the sheep's skin that survive the cleaning process. If that's true, it means wool waste isn't just providing nutrients and structure, it's also rebuilding the soil food web. The long-term effects of wool waste application are still being studied. Most trials have only run for a few years. What happens after 10 years? After 20 years? Does the benefit persist or fade? Do you need to reapply periodically? These are important questions that will affect how wool waste restoration gets used at scale. Early indications are positive. In some of the oldest trial sites, the benefits seem to be self-sustaining once vegetation is established. The plants create more organic matter, which feeds more microbes, which support more plants. The system starts cycling on its own without additional inputs. This is the ideal outcome, turning a one-time treatment into a permanent restoration. There's also potential for combining wool waste with other restoration strategies. Grazing management, for instance. If you're using wool waste to restore degraded rangeland, you can combine that with rotational grazing practices that prevent redegradation. The wool gets the vegetation started, and good management keeps it healthy. Or consider combining wool waste with native seed mixes. There are no plant seeds left in the soil. Applying wool waste without seeds might grow whatever weeds happen to blow in. But applying wool waste along with carefully selected native seeds can restore not just any vegetation but the right vegetation for that ecosystem. The water retention properties of wool waste are particularly exciting for climate change adaptation. As weather patterns become more variable, with longer droughts interspersed with heavy rainfall events, the ability of soil to capture and hold water becomes critical. Wool-amended soils are more resilient to these extremes, absorbing water during floods and releasing it slowly during droughts. Here's the big picture. We've got a waste problem, and we've got a degraded land problem. Both are massive in scale. Both are getting worse. Wool waste restoration doesn't solve either problem completely, but it turns one problem into part of the solution for the other. It's circular economy thinking applied to landscape restoration. Instead of waste going to landfills and degraded land staying degraded, the waste becomes a resource, and the land becomes productive again. The beauty of this approach is its simplicity. You don't need high-tech equipment or specialized expertise. You need wool waste, degraded land, and people willing to spread one on the other. The knowledge required is basic agronomy. The equipment is tractors and spreaders that farmers already have. The monitoring is just observing whether plants grow. This is a solution that can be implemented by communities in remote areas without outside expertise or expensive inputs. As climate change accelerates and land degradation worsens, we need solutions that are scalable, affordable, and sustainable. Wool waste restoration checks all those boxes. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a tool that deserves to be in the toolbox alongside other restoration methods. And unlike some restoration approaches that require decades to show results, wool waste can start showing benefits within months. The projects already underway are proving the concept works. Now it's about scaling up, refining the methods, building the supply chains, and getting more land managers to try it. With 4.4 billion pounds of wool waste produced annually and hundreds of millions of acres of degraded land needing restoration, there's plenty of opportunity for growth. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more videos about unexpected solutions to environmental problems, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.